How the Light Gets In is the Institute of Art and Ideas' unique festival, combining days full of talks and debates in philosophy, politics, arts and science, with evenings full of music and dance. Get your tickets for the world's largest music and philosophy festival at howthelightgetsin.org.
There are three kinds of lies, said Disraeli in a phrase that was popularized by Mark Twain: lies, damned lies, and statistics. I suppose that's inclusive enough to cover the variety and number of falsehoods that surround us these days, though there are times when I wonder. After all, we now live in a universe of fake news. Think of Brexit. Of course I mean don't, think of Trump. On the day that I began writing this talk, the Washington Post calculated that the president, and as you gather, I live in America, had told more than 4,000 whoppers during the first 20 months of his tenure. It's actually now about 5,000. Think, but really I don't need to go on. You all know what I mean. What role can poets play as we bob along on this current? And what do poets mean when they talk about the truth of poetry? That's what I want to talk about. And I'm going to organize my thoughts around a handful of phrases that the poets have come up with over the centuries, all of which contain the word truth or true. And I hope by the end that I've clarified what I think is the paradox that governs the whole notion. This, in essence, is the paradox that I mean. Politicians, philosophers, and anyone whose main purpose is to demonstrate a process of logical thought, teachers, for instance, like myself, generally aim to spell an exact proposition, a version of events that we, their audience, may or may not agree with. Poets, on the other hand, deploy imagery that is not dictated by the need to make a case, and use diction that is determined as much or more by sound as it is by semantics. Even such a poet as Dryden, who insisted that the words comprising a poem are the image and ornament of the thought it contains, and added that the primary purpose of a poem was to convey the apprehension of that thought. Even Dryden understood this, as a glance at any of his pages will confirm. So these are the tendencies we see when we are being asked to consider whether my mistress' eyes might or might not be like the sun. Sun would be nice. And it also explains why so many poets, and even a few critics, echo Archibald MacLeish's famous dictum that a poem should not mean but be. John Keats, for instance: we hate poetry that has a palpable design on us. A.E. Housman: poetry is not the thing said, but a way of saying it. T.S. Eliot: a poet has not a personality to express, but a particular medium, which is only a medium and not a personality. Wallace Stevens: some people always know exactly what they think. I'm afraid that I am not one of those people. I.A. Richards: it is never what a poem says that matters, but what it is. William Carlos Williams: only the imagination is real. All these remarks seem to describe a clear distinction between what is poetry and what is not. Yet if we think again about the phrase, a poem should not mean but be, we realize that it makes and does not make sense in just about equal parts. How can a poem not mean? Words do mean things, and all lines of poetry, including many of the greatest, inevitably and unavoidably have a propositional purpose. That business about my mistress' eyes, for one. This is no country for old men. Books are a load of crap. The examples are numberless, and the point they demonstrate is very well summarized, along with much else, by a beautiful sentence in the preface to the Lyrical Ballads. Poetry is the breath and finer spirit of all knowledge, carrying sensation into the midst of all objects of science itself. Here, Wordsworth creates a balance that helps us understand the relationship between meaning and being. He registers his engagement with things as they are, science itself, but at the same time suggests we might and most completely understand them by some means other than, or in addition to, strictly rational comprehension. By sensation, indeed, that proves the truth of poetry is not to be found in direct statements or judgments which exist in one place and one alone, but in the difficulties and idiosyncrasies of individual words and syntax, and in the imaginative enlargements of metaphor. Octavio Paz has something good to say about this. What characterizes a poem, he tells us, is its necessary dependence on words as much as its struggle to transcend them. Well, I'll come back to these notions in a moment, but now I need to give you some background and to show how they've evolved over time. And I want to begin by painting the backdrop, which of course means that I need to talk about Plato a bit, who in the Republic rejects the idea that poets are truth-tellers of any kind. I'll remind you. Book 10 of the Republic opens with the assertion that poets maim the thought of those who hear them, because according to the Platonic scheme of things, they are doomed to be imitators. That's to say, original and ideal forms are created by a god, craftsmen make early representations of these things, and poets, when they write about them, merely create an image in the world of becoming. Poets, in other words, exist at a third remove from what they represent in their lines, or as Plato himself says, they are thrice removed from the king and from the truth. This removedness, in which an idea of imitation and an idea of deception, or actual lying, are conflated, is the fatal weakness in poets from which all other defects grow, Plato tells us. Because poets don't know the original truth about anything, they really have no idea what they're talking about. And because they don't know what they're talking about, they have no means of putting what they claim to any kind of test. This is what makes them so dangerous for him. They have a disastrously partial view of the world, yet are continually trying to seduce their audience into a state of mental laxness in which passions of various kinds have the upper hand and reason is overthrown. Maybe, in a society considered as a mass of individuals, this wouldn't be the end of the world. But in the ideal community conceived by Plato, there is no clear separation between public and private worlds. Therefore, by posing a risk to individuals, poets also threaten the entire state. That's why they have to go into exile. And once they've been expelled, what are their chances of returning? Plato does allow the possibility by two means. He suggests that poetry might make a defense of itself in lyrical or some other meter, and he allows that those who are lovers of poetry might show not only that she is pleasant, but also useful to the state and to human life. For if it can be so proved, we shall surely be the gainers. I mean, if there be a use in poetry as well as a delight. Use and delight. They're presented here as sort of opposites. And yet when we cast our mind over the whole body of the Republic, we realize that Plato has not been true to his own word. Although in no sense a poem, the essays in the Republic use rhetorical and other strategies that commonly appear in poems. It aims to make its case, to be philosophically useful, at the same time as it seeks to hold our attention, to be delightful. In other words, for all its certainty about the dangers posed by poets and their lying, it can't avoid suggesting that some intermingling of truth and invention, of squaring up to reality and allowing for elaboration, of presenting cold facts and interpreting them with warm language, might not just be unavoidable, but actually desirable. Jump forward 1800 years to 1850 and listen to Sir Philip Sidney in the defense of poetry. His treatise was produced in a response to a now forgotten book called The School of Abuse by a Puritan writer called Stephen Gosson, who before dismissing poetry as simply a waste of time, accused it in a Platonic fashion of being the mother of lies and the nurse of abuse. Those phrases are Sidney's. Actually, by this stage, so many Greek and Roman poets, despite Plato's censure, had defended poetry as a divine power bestowed by the gods themselves, that Sidney feels no need to turn first to the idea of truthfulness. Instead, he focuses on the idea that poetry derives from the natural world, but only to improve on it. Nature never set forth the urch in so rich a tapestry as diverse poets have done, he says. Her world is brazen, the poets only deliver a golden. Only once this premise has been established does Sidney turn to the charges levelled against poets by Plato, letting him off several hooks by arguing that the Republic only ever meant to propose stamping out the abuse of poetry rather than poets themselves. Then Sidney dismisses the accusation that poets are fakers by saying the success and value of their work doesn't depend on how accurately it renders reality, but rather on how well it interprets its subject. In other words, he proposes that poets can't be called liars, since it's never their intention to tell the realistic truth in the first place. They don't share the ambition of historians and astronomers, as he says, to gain a knowledge of life that sets them on a level with God. Their intention instead is to communicate feeling and to discover its recurring patterns. And because these patterns are universal, he is able to consider the poet of all writers under the sun the least liar. This line of argument is pretty much in line with the ideas I sketched at the beginning of the talk, not least because it licenses the idea of poetry as a form of play, a formal elaboration or a decoration of the facts. And it's this aspect of the defense, Sidney's defense, that Shakespeare develops in a famous passage of the dialogue between Touchstone, the fool at Duke Senior's court, and Audrey the goatherd in Act 3, Scene 3 of As You Like It. Touchstone says, "Truly, I would the gods had made thee poetical." to Audrey, whom he's...
Get your tickets for the world's largest music and philosophy festival at howthelightgetsin.org.